are you doing? Okay, well, welcome. My name is Dion Rosser-Mims, and I serve as the Dean of the College of Education here at the university, and I am just excited. You are here today to experience what I think is some groundbreaking activity. We are re-debuting our lecture series, which began about 2 years ago. The College of Education's first education-focused leadership series. And at that time when we launched it, we did not name it after anyone. And so about 2 years later, with the help of several faculty and staff, we decided to name the lecture series after the very first named dean here at the College of Education here at Troy University, Mr. Max Rafferty. And so you have the opportunity today to hear from several speakers who Ruth Busby will introduce in a few moments, but you'll have an opportunity to hear some interesting trends, topics relative to leadership and education, and in particular, how leadership impacts, or how education and leadership intersect from a global perspective. So at this time, I would like to introduce Ruth Busby, who serves as the Executive Director for the College of Education. She has been instrumental in helping me and the rest of the college to launch this lecture series. Dr. Busby, please come forward.
Good morning. Thank you for coming today. Just a few logistics to take care of. There's coffee and water in the foyer for you to enjoy. We have amended our format just a little bit, so you should have a handout that looks like this. Down at the bottom, you will see the format. We have included a break at about 10:45 to 10:50 to allow those of you who have an 11 o'clock class to exit without distracting the presentation. And then we'll begin back at 11 o'clock sharp with the roundtable discussion. I will introduce to you the panelists at that time, and I'm sure you do not want to miss that part. That's going to be an interesting conversation with those two. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Troy University, as well as the Alabama Humanities Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Greg Russ is here today on behalf of the Alabama Humanities Foundation. Greg, would you wave to the crowd? Thank you so much. Very instrumental in bringing this to our student population today, so thank you so much. Okay, you also have some index cards on the end of the table. We encourage you to write down questions that you might want to pose to the speaker or to the panelists during Dr. Petrzela's lecture this morning. So at the end of the table, those of you who would just pass the index cards down the row, please include questions and we will pick those up during the break. Also included with your handout is an evaluation. If you need to leave at 10:50 for an 11 o'clock class, please complete that evaluation and leave it at your table, and we will have someone come by to pick it up. We very much value your feedback, so leave us feedback on that evaluation form so that we can improve our lecture series. Again, thank you for coming. Dr. Rosser-Mims will introduce our speaker at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Busby. So at this time, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Natalia Petrzela. Dr. Petrzela is an associate professor of history at the New York School in New York. She studies the politics and culture of the modern United States, including issues around race, gender, class, and identity. We are excited to have her to come here today to talk about Dr. Max Rafferty with respect to education at the Crossroads, understanding his perspective relative to the legacy of the 21st century education. Dr. Petrzela has done extensive research on Dr. Rafferty, and we are very excited to hear her talk about his legacy related to global leadership and related to education. Dr. Petrzela. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I go ahead? Thank you so much for this kind introduction and for the warm welcome to Troy. It is with sorrow that I am not there in person, but as may have been conveyed to you, airline drama got in the way of that. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, good. Thank you for being there this morning, and I'm excited to be here. So I want to start by talking about who Max Rafferty is. I have to say that several years ago, now almost 2 decades ago, I was a PhD student starting out, interested in part because of my own experience as a student going through American public schools, but then also being a public school teacher. I was interested, as I pursued my PhD in history, in studying the history of education and imagining how understanding that history could help us pave a better educational future forward. Being interested in questions of politics, race, culture, gender, all the things that Dean Mims so kindly mentioned in her opening introduction of me, I did not expect that this figure that I'd never heard of, Max Rafferty, a California and then US politician and educator, that he would loom so large in this early research, which became my first book, and then a whole article about just Max Rafferty and his legacy. So today what I want to do in the next half an hour or so, and then in our ongoing conversation, is one, tell you about Max Rafferty, the first dean of your institution, and to express, one, my surprise that he's not more remembered, not just in your institution, but more broadly, because he's someone who really had proximity to all kinds of historical figures who are in the history books. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Jesse Helms, George Wallace, Eleanor Roosevelt, believe it or not, that surprise that he's not a better known name, to correct the fact that to the extent he is remembered, and historians have started to remember him, that I think he's misunderstood. He's often portrayed as a kind of right-wing caricature, that here's this guy who represented only this sort of hardcore right-wing conservatism, and that's his only historical relevance. I think that's untrue, and I'll try to correct that. But third, that the kind of educational philosophy and politics that he represented actually reflect a kind of path not taken for American conservatism, and one that is not just an intellectual problem to kind of think about abstractly, but that in terms of three themes I'll return to throughout this lecture today, in terms of three themes I think are relevant for thinking about 21st century education in our increasingly global era. And I'll just spell out those three themes for you right now before we dive in. One is a kind of faith in critical inquiry and the ability of any individual, any child, to cultivate that ability to be to be critically engaged with their world. Two, a belief in a kind of cosmopolitanism and global awareness. Max Rafferty was somebody who spoke and taught multiple languages. He held a BA in history. He taught history. He wrote about history in his various books. And then three, a kind of sense that public education is a crucial American institution, that public education is the basis of a good and educated society. And I would say that those three themes, probably in that order, have receded from the kind of conservative agenda for American politics and education. And I think Rafferty would be very disappointed at that, and that examining his philosophies and his career retrospectively might generate some exciting ideas about how we might be able to imagine a different path forward. So without further ado, keep in mind that I can't see any of you, so I can't really read the room, but so far, so good, I guess. So my first question that I want to start with is the question of who is Max Rafferty? Now, this is a question, I put it in quotes, not only because we're addressing it today, but because that was the title, the headline of a 1963 profile in him, one of many to come. This was in a magazine called California Librarian, not exactly on coffee tables everywhere, but it was but profiles of Rafferty ended up in the New York Times, the National Review, the Wall Street Journal, Look magazine. He became someone really of national prominence. But in 1963, not that many people knew who he was. So let's talk about who this man was. So, like I mentioned, he made his career in California politics, despite having grown up in Sioux City, Iowa, something that he talked about a lot, his early childhood before his family moved westward after the Great Depression. He studied history at UCLA. He went on to write a doctoral thesis about personnel to pupil ratios, not very exciting, no offense, in graduate school. And he went on to become a teacher and an administrator, really working his way up and helping to build the California bureaucracy that would really make him a national figure. This first slide that I'm showing you here, that's a picture of Rafferty at the polling booth in 1963 when he first ran for and won the position of California State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Now that is definitely a mouthful, and perhaps you're already thinking, Jan, why are we talking about some bureaucrat from decades and decades ago? Well, one thing I think is really important to realize is that at that period, California education was the place. Everybody across the nation was looking to California schools. And I should say that they were doing so no matter where they stood politically. It was a pretty progressive place at that moment. And so you had a lot of progressives in other school systems looking there to see what California schools were doing, because they were very well-funded schools and it was an extremely dynamic school system. But you also had conservatives looking to California, also as an example, in many ways, of what they didn't want to happen in public schools. These are places where demographically schools are turning over very quickly, becoming much more ethnically diverse. These are places that are really becoming adventurous with quote unquote progressive curriculum, centering education around the child rather than around a one-size-fits-all curriculum, and experimenting with curricula like eventually ethnic studies, flexible scheduling, kind of experiential education, etc. So that's the world that Rafferty was coming up in. Now, as you see from that pamphlet, he ran 3 times for this position, and he served in it from 62 to 1970. He was pushing back on a lot of that progressive educational tendency. And he actually liked to be thought of, and this is often quoted, as the man who killed progressive education in California. That, as you might be able to deduce from the kind of suit and tie, and we'll talk more about his politics, the kind of conservative traditionalist sensibility that he embodied, his campaign for progressive education, at least name as campaign strategy. You can pamphlet there, California schools near the 4th R, reading, writing, arithmetic, and Rafferty. And now that was in the 1960s. That back to basics kind of educational philosophy, most people assume was part of the 1980s, but Rafferty was articulating that as early as the 1960s. And yeah, just to give you a sense, because I know it's kind of hard to imagine, he was resisting something called look-say literacy, where instead of teaching kids to memorize spelling, they would kind of like grapple with the whole word. They would use inventive spelling, a kind of more, less based on memorization, and I would say more kind of child-friendly and adventurous approach to education. And he was not a big fan of that. Okay. What Rafferty is probably became best known for in the public sphere was, or the national sphere, I should say, was when he ran for U.S. Senate in 1968. So Rafferty ran for U.S. Senate on the Republican ticket. He defeated the moderate Republican candidate in California, a guy named Thomas Kuchel, to a lot of people's surprise. Even Ronald Reagan, who ended up supporting him, said, was very resistant to support him at first. And as he kind of came, came to prominence and won that nomination, people talked about the waking, sleeping giant of conservatism in California, that the kind of traditionalism of Max Rafferty was signaled a kind of sea change in American politics. And that's really when he came on the scene most expressly nationally. That said, in a way hard to imagine, hard to imagine in the age of Twitter and social media, et cetera, Rafferty had since the early 1960s become not only a teacher, not only a administrator, but also a widely syndicated columnist and commentator. And he wrote multiple books. He was an extremely florid writer. He used the most vivid language that you could imagine to make his views known. To give you a sense, I mean, he talked about the need to root Philistines out of education, Philistines being people who didn't value intellectualism. Here is he would rail against what he called spineless university academics. He constantly, he wrote and sometimes yelled about draft dodging, demonstrating, and going overboard sexually as the things that would bring about the demise of American youth. Now, the first kind of lecture that brought him prominence, he gave back in 1961 when he was not yet the state superintendent. And that was called The Passing of the Patriot. Now, just remember that that was in the middle of the Cold War. And what Rafferty did there is he basically articulated patriotism, he said, as a sensibility or as a value that was as important as marital fidelity, as important as spiritual belief. And that kind of put him on the map as someone who was conservative, even before he became a Republican or announced himself as a conservative. And I think that's important to remember that in some ways, before he had any political affiliation, he was being coded as kind of having what were considered to be conservative values, being a kind of Cold Warrior patriot. Now, if you look, this is to that first point that I made of how is it that we don't remember as a country collectively much Max Rafferty? There you have Richard Nixon, taking out a full-page ad in support of his senatorial campaign in 1968. I need Max. Presidential candidates don't usually put their chips on the table so robustly with one person. Ronald Reagan, who spoke regularly in support of Rafferty and actually worked closely with him later in his career, early in Reagan's career, later in Rafferty's career, in terms of together stamping out what they called moral decline in California through various educational policies that aim to restore kind of moral rectitude to California schools in a moment, the late 1960s, where they saw that falling apart. And then this picture in the top corner that I hope you can see well, that's perhaps surprisingly, giving all these conservative bona fides that I've talked about, that's Max Rafferty and Eleanor Roosevelt. Yes, indeed, a young Max Rafferty. And he had invited Eleanor Roosevelt to speak to educators in the Needles School District, a school district over which he presided early on in his career. Now that is, just to give you a sense of like how the sausage is made in being a historian, that was one of the first pictures that I saw of Rafferty that made me question, wait a minute, is this guy really just quote unquote this larger than life conservative? What kind of larger than life conservative is inviting Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife to come speak to his school district in a moment when FDR is hated by conservatives, when having prominent women leadership come speak is not exactly seen as upholding traditional values? So to give you a sense, if any of you yourselves are budding historians, that was the source, the first one that made me think, Max Rafferty is more interesting than that two-dimensional character, which I've seen, referenced sort of offhandedly in certain historical narratives about the rise of conservatism. Okay, so let's go on. So here, a quote from Rafferty. I am an independent agent, and I have been so for the 22 years of my career and will remain so. He said this in an interview in 1962 when he was running for the nonpartisan office. That's important, the nonpartisan office of superintendent. And this is important, I think, because the LA Herald Examiner was a conservative paper, so he actually would have gained mileage by articulating a much more overtly conservative politics there. But I also think it's important because here we see that I think it gives a lens into something that was really important in Rafferty's career, which is that he again and again and again railed against what he called injecting politics into education. And here I have read many of his many speeches, not all of them. I think that's impossible. I don't know. He did it in his career, but he would go and speak to political groups, whether it was places like the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is very conservative, or the NAACP, the African American Advocacy Organization. And there, I quote him, he would proclaim pretty much the same line. Categorizing as left and right has gone too far on both sides. There should only be right and wrong. Okay, so he kind of wanted to get away from this left-right division, and he certainly had a moral vision, but he thought it transcended politics. I apologize for the sirens outside. You know, I'm truly in New York City here. To give you a sense also of how wide, how kind of much broader his appeal was before he became known as the conservative right-wing California politician. The California Teachers Association, that's the union, spoke out in his favor in the middle of the 1960s. And in 1962, they had called him one of their most popular contributors. And I think that's important because it is absolutely a through line of his career that even as he went further right, he valued teachers. He stood up for teaching as a profession. He believed teachers should be fairly paid, and even later on suggested incentive structures and other ways to get the best, what he believed were the best and the brightest, into the teaching profession. Now, believe it or not, I think it'll be my last point on his, what I think was a sincerely felt political independence, at least early on. The LA Times, after he won in 1962 for that first term as California superintendent, they said Rafferty's victory represents a united way forward among Californians. That is really remarkable if you look at it from the perspective of the later 1960s, when the society is seen to be, I think, kind of like today, very, very polarized, and Rafferty is associated with the right side of that polarization. The right, I mean politically right, whether you think it's right or wrong, I leave to you. Okay, so I have lots of other examples of that, but we can come to that maybe in the Q&A. Another important line from Rafferty that I want to linger on for a bit: I hate racial prejudice. This is something that he said in a variety of ways throughout his career. And he often talked about living, when he moved to Sacramento, the state capital of California, in an integrated neighborhood. He talked about his hiring record. He talked about, particularly later on, almost being nostalgic for integration when ethnic separatism became a way that a lot of political radicals who were fighting for ethnic self-determination, when they were saying we need Black power or brown power, I'll get to that later, he was almost nostalgic for racial integration. Now, one of the things that is really comes up in studying Rafferty, first, I looked at him as a California politician. Now, during the 1960s, and as people living in Alabama, this is no surprise to you, the national conversation about race was almost exclusively, particularly when covered in the media, about Black-white desegregation. In the wake of Brown v. Board Education of 1954, this is understandably the number one thing that people are talking about in terms of thinking about racial justice, especially in education. Now, California had its struggles with black-white desegregation. And I should really note that Rafferty was never on the side of busing. He believed in neighborhood integration, but he never supported busing. But what's fascinating is that even though Rafferty never wrote about it on a national scale, the issue of race and education and justice that he was most involved with was that involved Latino students, mostly Mexican-American children. And that is a concern that at the time took up a lot of his time as an administrator and as an educator, but which was not considered a national issue. And so I want to linger on that a bit because I think today, Latino education and the kind of presence of people from Latin America in this country is something which is preeminently a national concern. And so I think his thoughts there and his record there is really interesting. So one of the big demographic shifts that happened that made this such a central issue in Rafferty's administration was the Immigration Act of 1965. So that act changed national policy around immigration, and one of the main impacts for the Southwest and California in particular, really the whole country, but first in those areas, was many, many, many more immigrants from Latin America and from Asia. Mexican Americans overwhelmingly, and Mexican Americans, despite the presence of a lot of Asian immigrants and Asian American students, Mexican Americans were struggling a lot in California educationally. Now, again, showing you the seams of historical inquiry. I was really interested in race and ethnicity and education, and separate from my inquiries into Max Rafferty, who I believed only to be this kind of super conservative politician, I started looking into the way that California schools were dealing with this influx of Mexican American students, many of them who were not performing very well academically. The graduation rate, to give you a sense, 50% of Mexican American students in the mid-1960s didn't make it out of, didn't graduate junior high school, so 8th grade. So it was a pretty egregious thing. What I found is that throughout the early 1960s, Max Rafferty, this rock-ribbed conservative who I knew was against busing, he was promoting the education of the Mexican American in ways that were far more progressive than most people were doing throughout the rest of the country, and believe it or not, even than some people are doing today. One example, right here you have this pamphlet that was from a gathering called the Education of the, or a pamphlet called the Education of the Mexican American, which came out of a series of conferences that Rafferty organized throughout the 1960s, which I thought first cynically, oh, this brought together a bunch of kind of yes men and women who were assimilationists. Really not at all. They were promoting pedagogies, and this I think is very relevant to the point I made about globalism, and I think to your the way you might think about education. They promoted pedagogies that taught Spanish and English to both Anglo, what Californians called white kids at the time, Anglo children and Mexican American children. Rafferty himself said, we must promote a bilingual, bicultural citizen of tomorrow. He said that he believed every Anglo child had as much a responsibility to learn Spanish as every Mexican American child had to learn English. These are astonishing things that were being said by a conservative politician very early, much earlier than many progressives were even doing so. One of the ideas that he had, which he actually put into practice, which I was so surprised to see, was a textbook exchange between the Mexican Ministry of Education and California schools. And that wasn't just rhetoric. This was in 1965. Less than 6 months later, I'm reading now, districts with high concentrations of Spanish-speaking students in elementary school, and which were very socioeconomically diverse. This included Beverly Hills, which you've probably heard of, even if you're not from California, but also more agricultural places like Oxnard and Calexico. They had these textbook exchange programs, and he was even talking about doing a teacher exchanges as well. So that, this to me signifies a kind of complexity and a kind of affinity towards what honestly I would call progressive education, but at least a kind of progressive education around language and culture and ethnicity learning that is very hard to imagine in a conservative policymaker today, but which was very much a part of Rafferty's deeply felt ethical and kind of cultural commitments. To him, this did not go against being a traditionalist. This did not go against making America strong in the Cold War. It only supported it. Okay, one example of this, and I'm very reticent to say that anybody who is pushed, well, how do you feel on race? And they say, I'm not racist, I hired this guy, or my best friend is such and such. I think we should really push back on that. But I do want to point out the fact that his hiring record was one of the ways that was one of the things Rafferty pointed to in terms of his not being a racist. And he did appoint both an African-American educator named Wilson Riles, we'll get back to him later, and this guy who's on the stage, who's on the screen right now, Eugene Gonzalez. Eugene Gonzalez, they both of them were the highest ranking people in their positions in the California bureaucracy in that moment of their ethnicity. So Wilson Riles being African American, Eugene Gonzalez being Mexican American. And watching, I won't say too much about it now, but seeing Gonzalez and Rafferty work together in order to promote a kind of inclusive and not merely assimilationist approach to educating Mexican Americans in this period is really remarkable. I think a lot of people in this era think back to a time when you would get wrapped up the knuckles for speaking Spanish on the playground. That is not what Rafferty was about, despite being an educational traditionalist and eventually a conservative. He really believed that a kind of multilingualism and a celebration of what these Mexican American students brought to the classroom could be something that would really serve everybody in California schools. So that's happening throughout the 1960s. And I could read you so many good quotes, but I'm not going to. I want to go on from there, and we can get back to Gonzalez if you want in a bit, to say the way that this kind of changed, the way that this path that of a kind of conservatism, which I see as quite distinct from that one which prevails today, the way that that changed a bit. 1968 happens. It's a cliche to use 1968 as a turning point, but the truth is that for Rafferty and his politics, it really will. I told you he was a very vivid writer, and he wrote of 1968 like everywhere, and this is one of his kind of the typical phrases. It was an era of violence and venom, blasphemy and brouhaha. In 1968, as he saw people taking to the streets, and I'll stick with this issue of Mexican American education, he was actually horrified at the way that this cause that he had actually been a staunch supporter of, the way that it was being transformed and he thought really degraded. In 1968, to remind you, if you're not a student of history, I can't see you, my hunch is a lot of you are very young in this room. This is an era which is associated with radicalism, with people taking to the streets, with people protesting. And here, this thing that you see on the screen here, that is a brown beret demonstration. Those are Mexican Americans and their allies. They've taken on the name Chicano, which was a much more politicized, kind of radical way of describing their politics and their ethnicity. They're marching in their streets. They're walking out of school. If you see that sign that says raza sí, guerra no, raza is race, and it's associated with la raza, the movement, so kind of affirming their ethnic identity, but also guerra no is no war. And so they're connecting their fight for better education, for ethnic self-determination, for civil rights, with the fight against Vietnam, with the fight against the war in Vietnam. You might imagine that for somebody like Rafferty, who came to prominence supporting the Cold War and, giving speeches about the passing of American patriotism, it would be very hard to continue to be the supporter of Mexican American education in this climate when it was being associated with this kind of much more radical activism. Similarly, there's Lyndon Johnson in 1968 signing into law the Bilingual Education Act, which was a federal act that, believe it or not, in many ways was actually far more moderate than a lot of the programs that Rafferty himself had supported. There was no textbook exchange with Mexico. There was no white kids should be learning Spanish in the same way Latino kids should be learning English. It was actually pretty moderate, but what it was federal power. And that was something that Max Rafferty, whose politics very much supported local control of schools and a kind of and states' rights, he could not stand for it. And his politics were increasingly, even though he still had this nonpartisan office, moving in a way where kids marching in the streets, marching out of schools, protesting the war in Vietnam, and federal policy, which was meant to tell teachers and administrators and parents what they should be teaching their kids and taking their taxpayer dollars to do it, that became something that was increasingly untenable for him. And I think we kind of begin to see there the move rightward in his career. So this to me is an interesting quote in looking at the way that transition happens. So at one of those meetings that Rafferty had convened, again, by now, this is 1969. He's already actually run. The first meeting happens earlier in 67 before he's run as a Republican, but he's actually already run and lost to the Democratic candidate for Senate, but he's still holding these educational conferences for bilingual educators. And he says, no one knows who may step forward and make those present get the feeling that sí, las vistas se aclaran, which means basically that the road forward will become clearer. Now that to me is really fascinating because Rafferty was still holding these kind of conferences about Mexican American education. He calls them nuevas vistas. That is so noxious to a set of much further right conservatives in California that they will only call it new views or new vistas because they think like acknowledging Spanish should be spoken and not just stamped out in favor of learning English, that's not acceptable. But in this quote here, you both see Rafferty's continued embrace of, yes, speaking Spanish and bilingualism, holding these conferences, but also there's a tentativeness there, right? What is happening? Where is the world going? He used to talk about not being able to wait for the 660s to be over because the 70s would become paradise regained. But as the politics and culture changes, and not just because he loses the Senate race, I think he definitely becomes much less confident of that. So to give you a sense, to me, this is always a really interesting image to juxtapose with the walkouts and the kind of radical organization. Rafferty, during his Senate campaign in 1968, that you can see is in front of the California Republican League. He has his own kind of feet on the ground, but you can already see in this picture, these young women kind of groomed much more conservatively than the people that are walking out. They're holding up these signs and supporting a candidate who at this point is already a declared Republican and I think definitely moving to the right much more than he would have ever said in the early 1960s when he said, I am an independent. I think politics and education is in itself misguided. And you can see he was not as far right as a lot of people paint him to be. There were Democrats for Rafferty. I've got the buttons to prove it in that 1968 race. Now, by the time the 70s come and he comes to Troy, he leaves California after losing his third bid for a state superintendent after losing the Senate race. He loses to Wilson Riles. If you remember, the African-American liberal educator who he had appointed several years ago. And he's still kind of declaring the 70s will not bring Black or brown or yellow power schools. That's saying, that he's not on board with ethnic separatism, but it's becoming increasingly less clear that that will be the case. Here's another walkout of Latinos wanting to reform schools, not from policymakers in Sacramento, but themselves, and taking a really radical approach to doing so. That is something that was really hard for Rafferty to stomach. By way of conclusion, just a couple more minutes, this quote to me, I think, speaks in a way that is kind of sad given the promise of his early career and what he believed schools might hold. He said, in 1970, it is not too far-fetched to envision the classroom of the future as a cross between a commie cell and a burlesque runway. And now I've focused mostly on his activism around Mexican-American education here, but it's meaningful to say that one of the things that makes him a national figure in terms of educational politics is he was a hardcore opponent to sex education in the late 1960s. This is a pamphlet, he didn't write it, Is the Schoolhouse the Proper Place to Teach Raw Sex, which was circulated by the Christian Crusade and which actually took California schools as an example of both where kind of horribly sinful sex education was taking place, but also where there were, conservatives who were, oops, that's my timer, who I'll be done in a minute, where there were conservatives led by Rafferty in many ways, who were standing up to this total degradation of education to talk about sex in the schoolhouse. Now keep in mind, the sex education they were teaching was not particularly radical, but talking about sex at all at school, taking instructional time to do so, Rafferty and a lot of parents who supported him saw this as just the beginning of the end for what schools were supposed to represent and what they were teaching American youth. And this is all in the era where he's plotting his next move, leaving California. Now, he has offers to go advise Jesse Helms, other kind of national conservatives. He ends up going to Alabama, something we can talk about if you want. But just to give you a sense, if you're like, wait, what, sex education? Here's a questionnaire that was circulated by AntiSex Ed parents who saw Rafferty as like their one last hope in the administration. They connected sex ed to conditioning children to be like Pavlov's dogs, right? They would just be kind of conditioned to respond to their sexual urges. They saw it as connected to kind of plans for global domination through the World Health Organization, the National Education Association. Sweden is on there, right? That we would become a socialist country like Sweden. And so in this moment in the late Cold War, that kind of educational traditionalism that Rafferty advocated becomes wrapped up in a kind of much more doomsday perspective on where the world is going. This is from a letter that was written to Max Rafferty after he lost his last bid for state superintendent. I knew we were moving to the left, but I had no idea how far or how fast until Rafferty's defeat. And I think that change in mood that I referenced is very much evidence in there were tens, hundreds, probably thousands of these kind of letters that he got about what a lot of Californians believe to be a kind of fork in the road and a real shift in the direction of American politics and American schools. I want to just wrap up. That's Wilson Riles, who beat him in 1970. That was what the indication things were moving to the left. And things are moving to the left also from the perspective of everyday people, not just policymakers. It's from one California student newspaper where they say, these are students saying, this minority, those are the parents that Rafferty was supporting, are not just out after the family life program, but the entire school system. It will be up to the majority, progressives, who agree with that, the family life program, flexible scheduling, the new dress regulations, and other such programs to become informed and do something positive to improve them. It may already be too late. So they're seeing that kind of conservatism, these students, as encroaching on their, the kind of world that they want to build through schools. And the schools were changing. These are programs for pregnant students. I'm going to just pick up through the end so we can get to the Q&A. For pregnant students who, used to be just sent away from schools, but now were on taxpayer dollars being welcomed into schools and even having special programming from them. California, Santa Claus visiting schools, and to be more culturally responsive, wearing a sombrero in one Mexican-American school. So what I want to conclude by saying is here that I think that Max Rafferty, one, has not been remembered enough. Two, has not been remembered as a complex enough figure in terms of his celebration of critical inquiry. That early 1960s claim, we need to stamp the Philistines out of education, or keep them out of education. That's exactly right. That kind of defense of intellectual inquiry, I believe, is something that remained true throughout his career, and which has in many ways been lost when we look at conservative educational policymakers and activists today, that I think even more so, that celebration of globalism, of global education, of cosmopolitanism, of the importance of understanding and learning from the rest of the world, no matter what your background is. I think that is an important part of his legacy we must recognize, and I would say even celebrate. And three, and this is probably most important and most egregiously absent today, the celebration of public education. As I mentioned with several examples, and there are many more, Max Rafferty believed good public schools, he and I might diverge on what good means, but good public schools were core and foundational to American society, and that is something worth fighting for. And even through the end of his career, even as his politics took a decided turn, he fought for public schools to be meaningful places where kids learned values and learned to be citizens. That is something, as we see the defunding of public education today, I think K through 12 and in higher ed, which has largely been lost. And I think Max Rafferty's legacy helps us think about those in a light that can be instructive, not only historically, but hopefully going forward. So thank you. I can't see you, but I hope you're still in the room, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you. I want to take a moment, and I chose to do this after her lecture, and that is to recognize there are a couple of very important individuals, but one in particular is Miss Eileen Lee. If you will, please come forward.
Can you speak into the mic? I'm so sorry, I just can't hear you.
Now?
Yes, much better. Sorry, thank you.
And so I've just brought Eileen forward, and so we're really fortunate to have Dr. Rafferty's daughter here. And so if you will please give her a round of applause. She and I interacted several months ago and really asked support of Dr. Kimber, who will be introduced in you. She brought to my attention the wonderful, really complex history that your father had, but the leadership role that he played in the education field, and in particular, she introduced us to Dr. Petrzela. So, and very briefly, your remarks and thoughts about what you heard.
Well, I have spent time with Dr. Petrzela in the past, and she has interviewed me extensively, and my sister also, who is older than I. And my father was very complex. He was a very complex person. He held very fast to his beliefs in things. And I do believe that she's right in saying that he is kind of now just looked in a one-dimensional way as this conservative figure from the 60s. But if you look at him a little more deeply, you'll understand that I lived through having Spanish and English speaking children in the classroom together. Something that I wish we would see more today. I have the people that she's spoken about. I had dinner with the Reagans. Eleanor Roosevelt's lap. Wilson Riles, who won the election for the term after my father served as state superintendent in California. He was often in our home. He was not an elected person at the time. He was his deputy. And in the 60s, I thought all this, I grew up with this. I thought this was all really normal until I moved to the South. And I found out I had a big education when I moved to the South in my 20s. And my husband is from Alabama. And so when she talks about Eugene Gonzalez, I sat across the dinner table from these people because they would come and they would work in our home. And my father really believed in, equality for everybody. And I grew up in California. I never saw people I live here, and you do not know how thrilled I am to see the diversity in this room. Because when I first came to Troy, it really wasn't like that. But you and all of you are what I grew up with. That was in the 60s in California. Everybody was together. I went to school with kids from the reservation in Needles. My best friend was named Bernadette, and she didn't speak any English. And when I first met her, so he was a very complex person, but he had very strong beliefs. And I will tell you that the Republican Party courted my father. He was a wonderful speaker. He was part of the regents at Berkeley during all of the demonstrations in the 60s. I lived in a home that had I'm just going to say that I lived in an encampment. I was driven to school lying on the floorboard of a car because there were threats against my life because of my father. And I was the only child at home. I'm the youngest. I'm the baby of the family. I got to experience all kinds of really interesting things and very interesting people. But I didn't think it was really fun at the time. And so the lecture series being named for him is greatly appreciated by our family. And the diversity in this room makes me so happy because I've spent 20 years in Texas teaching kids, and I worked in the projects. I didn't go to College Station. I went to North Bryan after my degree at Texas A&M. My undergrad work at Troy. I was still running. I'm a Trojan Aggie. But in College Station, Texas, those kids are mostly professors' kids, and they didn't need me. So I went to North Bryan, where there was a lot of poverty back in the early 90s. And I stayed there for 20 years. I've been in Texas.
And I will get that circulated in just a moment. For this part of our lecture, we go to the roundtable discussion, where we will probably talk more about Rafferty's impact on Troy University and the community and maybe the state as a whole. We have a moderator, Dr. Karen Ross. Dr. Ross is an associate professor here at Troy University in the Division of History, and she has a PhD in Science, Technology, and Medicine from the University of Minnesota. We allowed her in the South anyway. Welcome, Dr. Ross. And we have our panelists, the Honorable Sam Adams. You'll wave to us. Mr. Adams is the son of Dr. Ralph Adams, who was a former chancellor at Troy University, who actually preceded Dr. Hawkins and served a tenure of 25 years. Dr. James Kimbrough is a former dean of the College of Education and followed Dr. Rafferty. So this should make for an interesting conversation. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you. And Dr. Petrzela, can you hear us all right?
Yes, I can. I will pipe up rudely and interrupt if I cannot, but so far so good. Thank you. And thank you all for being there.
We will try to project. I think maybe the best way to get started, I would like to hear a little bit more, Dr. Kimbrough, from you who knew him.
Yes.
And worked with him, and maybe if you give us a bit of your impressions of his legacy here at Troy, and we can perhaps direct the conversation to Dr. Rafferty's experience here in the 70s and early 80s at Troy.
Yes, I'm glad to. I appreciate this opportunity to be here today with Dr. Ross and Mims. I came to Troy University as an assistant professor in the summer of 1972. Dr. Rafferty was the dean who employed me. and Dr. Ralph Adams, Sam's dad, was our president. And because of those two individuals, I remained at Troy University for 30 years. I thoroughly enjoyed working with both of those gentlemen. They were very supportive of our efforts to promote a quality teacher education program here at Troy. I wish that more of our students were here to hear what I'm going to say right now, because I would love them to hear this. So if we have professors in here who could share it with your students, please do so. Several years ago, many years ago, I read Dr. Rafferty's book, Suffer Little Children. And I would encourage you, if you haven't read it, and I would encourage you to tell your students to read it. Encourage them to read this book. I had read it a long time ago, but I checked it out about 2 weeks ago. Troy University here did not have a book, but Troy University in Dothan did. And I wanted to just refresh some of the ideas that I had read about years ago. And I'm glad that I did, because it's in line with so much of what was presented earlier by our distinguished lecturer. Dr. Rafferty in that book talked about dumbing down of education, and he questioned teacher education programs. He was concerned that they were focusing too much on the how to teach, but teachers didn't know what to teach. So he was focusing on knowledge. I enjoyed working with Dr. Rafferty because he was an organized person. I like that. When we would have a faculty meeting, we would start with the faculty meeting happened to be scheduled at 3 p.m. We started at 3 p.m. sharp. He also conducted the faculty meeting in such a way that we were able to accomplish quite a lot, but he would not allow us to ramble on and on, and I like that. Dr. Rafferty cared about his faculty and his staff and his students. Dr. Rafferty was an excellent teacher. We had a capstone course that all seniors were required to take. And at that time, we were organized on a 4-quarter system. And Dr. Rafferty taught this capstone course each quarter. And he had so much to share with his classes because he was truly intelligent. And he was concerned about the education that his students were getting. He was interested in reaching out to them and bringing them along. He had a vocabulary that was absolutely unreal. In fact, when I was reading through Suffer Your Little Children recently, I thought, you just about have to have a dictionary to understand some of the concepts that Dr. Rafferty was trying to get across. But Dr. Rafferty was a really good teacher in that he was able to communicate. What a communicator he was. And he also was very witty and entertaining. His students loved his classes. And I think that's so important, that they have a teacher such as Dr. Rafferty. And we'll have to thank Dr. Adams for bringing Dr. Rafferty to California. Sam, Dr. Adams did a good day's work when he brought Dr. Rafferty to Troy University.
And I think that brings up a really good question and perhaps transition to talk a bit about your father, why he brought him, and what was, do you know much about the recruiting Rafferty to Alabama?
Yes. For a little background, my father was a career military officer in the Air Force. He also got a degree in education. and Governor Wallace appointed him in the summer of 1964 to come to Troy State. He came to Troy State, and it was a sleepy provincial college that really was just sitting there. And he felt it important to provide the best education to the students that he possibly could. And he recognized that part of that would be to bring in top-notch educators. He had followed Dr. Rafferty's climb nationally. He did not know much about the California education system, but he and Dr. Rafferty were basically born in the same era. I think Dr. Rafferty was born about 1917. My father was in 1915, and they suffered through the Depression. So they had very core values that were quite similar. Dr. Rafferty had gone out to California, and I mentioned the fact that their family had gone out to California, part of which was that Dr. Rafferty had a sister who was quite an accomplished actress, and she was very successful with that. And I'll get to that in just a minute, but at the time, Dr. Adams started looking for leaders that could propel the university into the direction it should go. And that he did. He brought in a number of really prominent people from around not only the state, the country, but the world. Specifically, I remember having an opportunity similar to what you're describing, because my father thought it was important that children should be introduced to really great people. And Dr. Edward Teller came, and he was the father of the hydrogen bomb. And he spoke here at Troy. He was a visiting professor. A lady named Ruth of Arabon, who was a Thai princess, and some of y'all may can harken back to The King and I. Well, she was one of the daughters of the king, and she went around describing the activities of things like that. He hired a fellow named John Chamberlain to come and work in the communications area, and he had been the editor of what we used to know as Look magazine, which was a pretty impressive program. And so when the opportunity arose, and Dad followed Dr. Rafferty's career as superintendent very carefully, he totally endorsed the concepts of reading, writing, and Rafferty that were being espoused in California. And as soon as he lost the election, my father called him and talked to him. And in the summer of 1970, Dr. Rafferty came and gave the commencement speech here at Troy University, at that time Troy College. And they hit it off, and they understood each other, they appreciated each other, and they formed a bond. And as such, Dr. Adams extended an opportunity to open up a new college here and have him serve as dean of the School of Education. And as a backdrop, this was a teacher school. That's what it started out as back in 1887 or somewhere back in that time. And he felt that that was something that had been absent and that we needed a world-class leader for that purpose. So Dr. Adams extended the invitation. Dr. Rafferty readily agreed and came to Alabama and did a phenomenal job for those 10 years.
Thank you. I'm curious to know, as someone who doesn't study this period of American history myself, I studied a little bit earlier time, that perhaps Dr. Petrzela and our panelists here as well could speak a little bit about Rafferty's approach in the 70s at the College of Education in not only, as you talk about bringing in great speakers and important people from all kinds of fields to the institution, but also this is a period in which Troy is integrating and in which there's massive changes taking place in Southern education, as we alluded to before the break. Do you know, maybe Dr. Petrzela, you could start with talking about his approach in this intersection of leadership, education, etc., for our panel here.
Yeah, well, I'm actually really interested, not to punt, but to hear from my fellow fellow speakers on the roundtable, because I'm far from an expert on Troy education or on that era on your campus. I will say it's really interesting the way you just described that as, of course, you know, Troy and the South in general and the nation in general going through this incredibly tumultuous period in the late 60s and 70s when Rafferty came there. What's interesting from the perspective of having come to his career, you know, from the angle of looking at his career in California, is that he wrote very favorably about the reason that he was going to Troy instead of honestly taking up maybe some more high profile positions, advising sort of more national figures. He described Troy as what he saw as the last law and order campus in America. And that to me was such an interesting perspective, because I think, look, here's someone who's dealing with dramas at UC Berkeley every day. Like, this is a totally different kind of climate. And of course, even the language of law and order speaks to a sense that Troy had a political culture which was very different from what was ascended in California and maybe even in the rest of the country. So I don't know if that impression was true. Maybe, I think it's a really great question. I'd love to hear from the others who actually were there and have a deeper understanding of that era in your town and on your campus.
Thank you. And either of you be able to address, just, you know, Dr. Rafferty's approach in what was an important time period and the increasingly diversity in our college education and the programs.
I'll be glad to do so. I don't know what college at Troy employed the first Afro-American professor, but I do know that Dr. Rafferty was among the first deans. He could have been the first, I'm not sure, to employ an African-American lady. I worked with her in the area of elementary education for several years. And then from Dr. Weiss, is her name, we began to get faculty from around the globe. We were trying to expose our students to faculty members who were from the cultures and other parts of the world, so that our students would have broader understanding and appreciation for people throughout our world.
Something that still speaks very strongly
That's
to
right.
the Troy University values.
And another aspect of the teacher education program, which I appreciated, which Dr. Rafferty had a big part in providing this. Our teacher education program provided what we called then student teaching. Now it's an internship, I believe. But at Troy, I found the internship program, student teaching program, to be perhaps more advanced than I had observed in some other places, in that we had faculty members to teach methods and materials courses who were trained in the academic areas of English and math, science, and so forth. We didn't have just a generalist teaching how to teach English or how to teach math. We had someone who knew the subject, and Dr. Rafferty wanted our students to know what they were teaching. And also, we would have faculty members from the various colleges across the campus to supervise our interns, because they understood the content that was being taught, and they could help the interns in case they had difficulty and had questions. So we had, I think, such a quality program. Yeah, I was just so pleased to be a part of it. Yes.
One aspect of Dr. Adams' career being military, he had served all around the world. And President Eisenhower integrated the military, and it was a part of life, and Dr. Adams embraced that. And don't believe anything I say, totally independently verified, but I believe Troy State College was the first four-year institution in the state of Alabama that was integrated. And the way it was done was, it was because Troy State College had a branch at Maxwell Air Force Base. And all federal enclaves, all posts any student was available to go to that college. And they in fact had a number of black students at Maxwell that participated. And so that's something that is, I think very near to dear. And I think my father was very, he was very open-minded about integration. It was not something that he fought at all. He was very close to Governor Wallace. There's no question about that. And Governor Wallace was a premier politician. And it's amazing what you can accomplish being a politician, changing your viewpoints from one way to the other. He was a pure segregationist when it suited him to be a segregationist. And when he recognized that that is not the right thing to do, he changed and was embraced. But Dr. Adams, when we were talking about the law and order campus, I think that was a correct interpretation. If you recall, between the 1960 and say 1975 era, those were volatile times on college campuses. And I was here the whole time. I went to the lab school, Kilby Hall, and I had student teachers help us walk in as student aides, which is one of the things Dr. Rafferty was instrumental in doing to getting that involved. But the concept was that students were here to learn and not to get in political rank-ring with the administration. It didn't go perfectly, but it was a lot smoother on this campus than others. But that's not to say that all the professors here were staunch conservatives. In fact, I think Dr. Adams went out of his way to find very qualified individuals to fill positions in the philosophy department and the religion department that may not have necessarily had the same point of view, but they had great creds. They had gone to outstanding universities. In fact, I think one of the things Dad really wanted to do was see that the PhD level at Troy University for the instructors was up to like 50% at some point in time, and it had not reached that point. So when Dr. Rafferty came to the university, he found it a welcome era. I mean, it was a welcome time in some circles, but he was very hardcore on a lot of the really key positions that my father completely endorsed. But that does not mean that they were not willing to listen to the other point of view and have things. I brought some things over here from the 60s and 70s that you might want to take a look at later. Some of them are the Palladium, which are the yearbooks, and it describes when Dr. Rafferty was brought here to Alabama, and shows when they named the chair after him, and a lot of stuff in between. And so it was a difficult era, but a lot of presidents, and I think Dr. Rafferty mentioned this in one of his articles that I read, was that, if you were lucky if you were president of the university and lasted 3 years. I mean, it was just that tumultuous. And Dr. Adams knew how to balance people's, interest in trying to reach a consensus without violating his core values.
One of the things I found really interesting about your work, Dr. Petrzela, was this idea of, you're talking about the road not taken, the foundation, the importance of public education for making good citizens, etc., critical inquiry, and this international global approach. And that's something we talk a lot about at Troy University, is this idea of a global approach to education, which is easier than ever now with technology. How do you see this conversation? And I know you're a historian and not a maybe political scientist, but Dr. Petrzela, our panelists here, what is the way forward in another period where we're very divided and polarized politically in finding that common ground in education and leadership in education? So putting you a bit on the spot here, I know, but.
No, that's okay. Although, like most historians, I punt when talking about the future. But I mean, one of the reasons that I kind of made this point in a way that I probably wouldn't have highlighted that global perspective as much maybe 10 years ago, because I think it didn't seem as imperiled, nor did Rafferty's perspectives on this issue seem that exemplary 10 years ago, I think. But today, because they were, I mean, he was someone, like, everything I said is true, valuing languages, studying history, other cultures, and the stuff with Mexican American kids was extraordinarily forward thinking for his time and even now. But I think we really have seen in the last several years a kind of, I mean, I don't want to get too political, but to me, like, America first and a kind of decided rejection of university expertise and what goes on campuses as kind of useless in preparing ourselves to be citizens. Like, that's become one dominant form of political discourse today. And so to me, I mean, drawing on the Rafferty example, but also more broadly, kind of reviving a commitment to education, public education, I think, as a core part of citizenship, but also, kind of deep knowledge and understanding, not just of history, but of politics and of culture and of language and of ourselves as part of the world is the first step, I think, in any meaningful future for Americans or more broadly. I just can't believe I'm saying this. I have to say this about America in 2019, because it seems like there have been people who have had to say this for decades and decades, but we somehow seem to be there right now, where even Max Rafferty's relatively moderate perspective, you should speak languages and know about the rest of the world, in the 1960s and 70s, that even feels like something we need to reinvigorate because it is in peril.
Thank you.
In the items over here on this table is a letter that Max Rafferty wrote to my father at a request from a fellow named Dr. Fred Barnett, who was the president of a national organization for international decision-making, I guess. It was headquartered in New York City. And Dr. Barnett had known Dr. Adams in the service, and he sent him a request back in 1974 asking, can you give me an idea about how we should address trying to avoid wars and conflicts, because we were just riding out of the Vietnam War. How do you avoid further conflicts? And so Dr. Rafferty penned a very strong letter, and it's a 6-point plan. I won't go into it, but you can take a picture of it if you want. It's sitting over there. And it was a global perspective. It was something that was going to reach far away and into very large arenas, not only in the congressional sense of the United States, but around the world. And so there are a lot of opportunities that Troy has to embrace this kind of thing. I don't know if I'm getting this right or not, but Dr. Adams was involved with something called the English Speaking Union. And early on in his tenure, he started bringing students over from England and Japan as a kind of a swap, where you would send 2 Troy State students over to either Japan or England, and those students would reciprocate, those schools would reciprocate by sending students here. And these were like from schools like Oxford and Cambridge and things like that. And so the impact that Troy has globally is just starting. I know Dr. Rafferty was involved with the English Speaking Union students because he would tutor them and give them kind of insights on a small scale class that was really something that they could take back with them and spread his knowledge to the rest of the world.
I'd like to make a comment about Dr. Rafferty's quick wit and his ability to express his thoughts just in an instant. Troy was having tremendous success in branching out to provide educational opportunities throughout Alabama, throughout other states, and throughout the world. And some of the college people in the state were questioning our doing this. And in fact, some of the people called us a kudzu college. But Dr. Rafferty really, he said what needed to be said, and I thought it was choice. He said, yes, we may be, but he said, kudzu was brought into our country to stop the erosion of the soil. Troy University is here to stop the erosion of the mind. I think that put a stop to the criticism. I'd also like to point out, Dr. Rafferty was a caring man. He would visit our faculty offices periodically, sit down, talk with us, ask us how things were going, if we had any problems that he might be able to help us with. He would also visit our classes and then talk with us about what he had observed. He would, one afternoon, I remember very vividly because I appreciate his doing this. Dr. Rafferty arrived for work at 8 o'clock sharp. He departed at 4:30 in the afternoon. You could set your watch by Dr. Rafferty's arrival and departure. Well, one afternoon, I was in my office working on a project. I was at this time director of teacher education, the internship program, and I was just really busy trying to assign some students for their internships. And it was 4:30, Dr. Rafferty walked by. He said, Dr. Kimbrough, you stay in your office too late in the afternoons, I've noticed. He said, you need to get up, go home, and enjoy your wife and children. And I want you to do that. And that showed an interest in me that I appreciate. I really appreciate. He cared.
Well, thank you very much. Ruth, how are we on time?
Probably need to go ahead and start.
Okay. Okay, to stick somewhat to our schedule, we'll go ahead and wrap up, but I would like to thank our panelists. Yes, yeah, sure.
I meant to mention this earlier when we were talking about moving to California. And this is just something, as a son of the president, it's kind of like what you were saying. You got to meet some interesting people. And I was a senior up at Alabama and getting ready to go on to law school. And my father calls me up and says, I want you to come home and have dinner with us. Well, that was very unusual because my father could care less about what I was doing for the most part. And so I said, I'll be glad to. So I came home that evening and there was a very private, small dinner at our house. And oddly enough, I was invited to it. And normally when I was young, my father had the principle of you're to be seen and not heard concept, which I tried to follow. But this time he gave me an opportunity to sit at the table. And at the table was none other than Dr. Max Rafferty, which was kind of neat. But also there was a lady named Helen Byrne, who was from Montgomery, who ran the Davis Theater, and her husband. And then this lady at the end of the table was there. And I didn't recognize her, wasn't really sure who she was. And they started talking, and I just sat there quietly and realized that this lady was none other than Olivia de Havilland. Now, she was, for some of y'all who are aware of that, she was one of the stars in Gone with the Wind. Olivia de Havilland is still alive today at age 103. And I had never seen such repartee as the wit and the humor between Ms. de Havilland and Dr. Rafferty. It was stellar. And my dad and my mom were in there, and they were kind of trying to orchestrate it. It got way out of hand. They were just having too much fun. But it's just, I'm trying to kind of draft up what you say. He was a delightful man. He was very, very committed to his principles. He wanted people to understand that he thought that this was the best route for our country to take. But in his heart of hearts, he was a kind man. He was a generous man, and he was a very funny man, but he really embodied what I think we can all see as the opportunities he was a visionary because the things that he saw 40 and 50 years ago have in so many ways come to pass. And if we can return to some of those core values, I think maybe our educational system can really explode into great positive things. But anyway, that was just one of the opportunities I saw that Dr. Rafferty had to interact with somebody of that caliber, and that, you know, he met so many people. And you were saying, I think, that y'all lived on Rodeo Drive, or okay.
When he went to high school.
Oh, he went to high school.
He went to high school in Beverly Hills, and they lived on Rodeo Drive, and it wasn't Rodeo. And, but I thought growing up that it was normal to meet people like Ronald Reagan and share pictures of your horses out of your wallet, and, you know, Lucille Ball. And I mean, my aunt was an actress, and we were seen and not heard a good part of the time. And I was the youngest, so I remember the seen and not heard. Yeah.
Anyway, we were very, very thankful.
Yeah, we were lucky. I thought everybody knew those people. I didn't know.
Well, thank you very much. And I do want to thank our panelists, Dr. Kimbrough, and of course our speaker. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Raffertys. And she will.
Yes, sir. Dr. Ross, thank you. Fantastic job moderating our discussion. This is a conclusion to our 2019 lecture series. Before we officially wrap up, I do want to express my sincere gratitude for our panelists, Honorable Adams and Dr. Kimbrough, and also Ms. Eileen. Thank you so much for your support and allowing us to honor your father in this way. To our lecturer, thank you so much.
Yes. Sorry I'm not there. I wish I could be.
The invitation is still open for you to pay us a visit here in the wonderful Troy University. I think you're going to find it to be the most beautiful campus in Alabama. And so we have dubbed ourselves, and I do believe we do have the most beautiful campus in the state. And finally, we have scheduled our next lecture in the spring on February the 25th, and we have